Perfect is boring. This sounds like what motivational posters say to make you feel better about failing, right? But it's always what I tell myself when I suck at something. After all, every artist will have their heart broken by the world, more often by our expectations of it than anything else. And the first time I watched Tim Burton's Ed Wood, an embellished biopic about the worst director of all time, I wasn't old enough to understand how someone could go barreling from one project to another without improving. Watching it again at this age, I finally understand what confused me as a teenager. Ed Wood sucked. But he never felt like an imposter. The rest of us, including me, can't stop feeling like one, which makes him both an inspiration and a warning about what happens when passion meets zero self-awareness. And understanding the difference might be the only thing standing between us making something imperfect and making nothing at all. Imposter syndrome is the fight between what we think we can do and what we can do. Yet to even call it a syndrome is to downplay how normal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem. Self-doubt can be useful, humanizing, but feelings of imposterism confine people inside an invisible box. Limiting what they can reach for based on arbitrary "I'm not good enough"isms often has a direct reaction to success. It takes many forms. Some people see any mistake as proof they're frauds. Some think they should be able to handle everything alone. Some believe if it's hard, they're not cut out for it. Some even measure their worth entirely by credentials that never feel like enough. Maya Angelou, despite writing 11 award-winning books, never stopped doubting if her voice deserved to be heard. Einstein called himself a swindler, convinced that compared to Isaac Newton, his accomplishments were inferior. Who knows how much they could have shown the world if they weren't afraid? So where do these feelings come from? Well, people who are often highly skilled at something tend to think that others are just as equally skilled. This spirals into feelings of unworthiness like, I don't deserve this more than anyone else. But it doesn't matter if you're even well known. Everyone is susceptible to doubt but believe we're alone in it because no one voices it. True, some people never doubt themselves at all. About 7% of the population has what psychologists call dark triad traits. Narcissism, it's all about me, Machiavellianism, I'll do whatever it takes, and psychopathy, I feel no remorse. These people rarely question their worthiness or abilities even when they should. When Ed Wood was asked if he knew anything about film production, he said, I like to think so, which he did. Think so, not actually know anything about film production. But Ed Wood wasn't a dark triad. By all accounts, he was optimistic, friendly, passionate. He had more enthusiasm than skill, but was incredibly resourceful with what little time, energy, and money he could scrape together. He just genuinely couldn't see the gap between his vision and his ability, which meant he never felt like an imposter. If you watch Tim Burton's film about his life, you can see Ed Wood's best movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, is a 0 in terms of skill, but a 10 in courage and perseverance. Are the sets tiny? Is there random stock footage including of a dead actor? Is the dialogue really, really cheesy? Well, yeah, but it has heart. Plan 9 is about an alien race who comes in peace but are repeatedly denied, so they resurrect the dead to force humans to pay attention. It's about the stupidity of humanity, the horrors of war perpetuated by greed. As Oscar Wilde said, all bad poetry springs from genuine feelings. The same goes for bad art and movies. Ed Wood wasn't an imposter because he made movies he cared very much about, which is exactly what makes his story so difficult. Because focusing only on his passion and sincerity gives you permission to ignore craft entirely. But focusing only on his decline, the alcoholism, the poverty, the exploitative films, is just another voice telling you to stay paralyzed by doubt. Ed Wood's optimism kept him creating when most of us would have given up. But it's also what kept him from getting better. So the question becomes, how do you have his fearlessness without his delusion? How do you lean into imposter syndrome without giving into it? The answer is somewhere between the man everyone loved and the cautionary tale everyone warns you about. Don't take it too seriously, we're all doing great work. That was Ed Wood's response to almost anything. In a bad review, he could pick out a single compliment of army uniforms looking realistic and spin it. He'd seen worse reviews, they praised the realism. His car could be smoking and groaning, but he'd have faith that it would get him where he was going, rain or shine. If his movie failed, he'd confidently say, "My next one will be better." And somehow, people believed him. Not because he was a great director, he really wasn't, but because his energy was infectious. He was the only person in Hollywood who didn't judge, because as he put it, "Otherwise I wouldn't have any friends." So, who was Ed Wood? Born in 1924 in Poughkeepsie, New York, Wood's childhood was largely normal with two exceptions that carried into his adult life. The first was his love of horror films since he was 7, an inspiration obvious in the types of stories he would go on to write. The second was his mother had always wanted a girl. After the birth of his younger brother, she would dress Wood in girls' clothing, an event he would look back on with warmth and affection and which would influence him to cross-dress well into adulthood. This inspired his first film, Glenn or Glenda, a film regarded as one of the worst ever made when it was released, but now has a cult following due to its peculiar yet charming style and its early cinematic themes of transgender identity and gender fluidity. His desire to tell true stories showed in his response to those shocked he'd play the titular character and their suggestions for wigs that would make him look pretty. "I don't want to look pretty. I want to look like myself." He wanted his movies to have a message, even if a film was originally meant to be exploitative or if it was about grave robbers from outer space. Part of Wood's issue was he was a fast typist first, storyteller second, and filmmaker third, but it meant he could churn out scripts fast, pitch constantly, and keep moving. Written, produced, directed by Edward D. Wood Jr. He loved to bill himself as an all-rounder like Orson Welles. Unfortunately, he wasn't good with money. Fortunately, he could always charm someone, including even the Baptist Church of Beverly Hills who produced Plan 9 from Outer Space, who could help him get the job done. One of the great things about movies from Ed Wood was that even though he was a bad director and his movies were low budget, they were very sincere. He really tried to educate the audience in Glenn or Glenda and warn people about the dangers of war in Plan 9. He didn't do it effectively, but his sincerity is unmistakable and endearing, and that sets him apart from most other bad movie directors who are often bad because of laziness, arrogance, or intentionality. Plan 9 really is a fun film. Granted, it didn't always make sense, like aliens perfected spaceflight and how to resurrect the dead, but they couldn't manage to put a fire extinguisher on their spaceship? But he was really cooking with the idea that peaceful aliens reach out to humans, get denied, realize how stupid we are, and humans respond by throwing punches. I appreciate that the movie was bad but not lazy, nor was it unambitious. But how did he really get these movies made? Well, sometimes a few hours before filming, he'd have the sets up using whatever was available, from gum wrappers to shower curtains, paper plates, toy models. Their soundstage for Plan 9 was sandwiched between a hotel and a bar, and the minimal budget required him to edit in stock footage, which he spun positively, calling it a waste that wonderful footage would otherwise get filed away, never to be seen again. He surrounded himself with weirdos, but among those who were unafraid of showing their deepest insides was where Wood felt most comfortable. Such a person he found in Bela Lugosi, whose role of Dracula defined not only Wood's childhood love of horror, but also established the character as a cultural icon. Their friendship spans half of Wood's movies. Of Lugosi's passing, Plan 9, billed as Lugosi's last film, features a funeral with a speech that goes, "The bell has rung upon his great career. Now we lay him to rest. A rest well-deserved but so premature." Wood likely saw in Lugosi his childhood and future. He wanted to save him from his serious addiction to morphine, perhaps for innocent reasons, but also to prove to himself that his dreams weren't hopeless. In reference to ethical concerns about using the footage after Lugosi's death, Wood insisted Lugosi would have loved it. He returned from the grave, just like Dracula. It was actually kind of clever how he worked in the footage and turned Lugosi into one of the undead, resurrecting his beloved mentor for his last film in more ways than one. Wood regularly attracted people who had something special to give the world but who weren't equipped to make it big. Vampira didn't want to sell the rights to her character and saw her show cancelled. Lugosi was typecast and eventually so forgotten people thought he was dead long before that time actually came. actor Johnson was the butt of jokes for being a big, dumb Swede when he actually had hardly any accent. These were his kind of people. And in the end, they were all really pleased with what they'd made together. "This is the one I'll be remembered for," Wood said, and Plan 9 really was. As early as 1961, Plan 9 was appearing on local TV. People couldn't believe what they were seeing, and that made it endearing. He loved to call his friends while he stayed up all night writing and tell them it was on. But the films he was passionate about only lasted 6 years, though many of them have become cult classics. To me, the line between Wood's films and the ones during his time that were considered absolute cinema is really marginal. As time has passed, we've actually become less critical over what makes a movie good. We can appreciate Wood's ambition to just tell stories, not to be the best at it or to make the most money or win awards. He just wanted to make a movie to fund his next movie because he had a lot of bizarro stories to tell, the most important among them that his own belief that with his next, he could get better. I will say this for Ed Wood, no matter what, he managed to make and finish his films. Most of us give up on our dreams at the first roadblock. He's brought me a lot of joy and inspiration because Wood didn't have the budget, connections, or Orson Welles' arrogance, but he went ahead and did it anyway. Tim Burton's biopic is clearly inspired not just by Wood's life, but his movies themselves. He made Ed Wood because he related to Wood as a passionate outsider who loved making movies despite being considered a weirdo, viewing Wood's unbridled enthusiasm as a kindred spirit and a celebration of creativity over commercial success. What I didn't understand as a teenager was that Wood's optimism wasn't just fuel, it was a shield. It let him make movies with heart, but it also kept him from reflecting, changing, or confronting what was really holding him back. As Wood wrote in Glenn or Glenda, "I can't make sense to myself sometimes." He was a man with boundless enthusiasm and persistence who just didn't know how to direct it. And he preferred to gamble with what he had and try for the best. Unfortunately, during his lifetime, he had more losses than wins. One of Wood's major issues is he often collapsed into whatever others wanted, trying to make them happy enough to be on his side. Like selling the film Bride of the Atom, later Bride of the Monster, as a sci-fi horror film, then deciding it would be a heartbreaking romance upon hearing that's what a woman in the crowd loved. Of course, this is Hollywood embellishment, but it's pretty similar to accounts of how he got his movies made. He'd pump out a new script, cut the budget, rely too much on star power, and play whatever angle he could to get people interested. In Bride of the Monster, he even replaced his girlfriend for whom he'd written the part when it looked like a new star could get him the $60K to get it made, which she proved unable to provide. The film ended up getting finished, but only because he agreed to put a backer's son in the movie and change its ending to feature an explosion. Wood was just happy the movie was getting made, or that's what he told people. For dramatic effect, Tim Burton's version of his life downplayed how popular Ed Wood was. He did have people who were interested in him. The problem was he didn't have the business sense or the film know-how to make it all work. What Burton didn't downplay was Wood always grifting people through changes, additions, even lies. He'd oversell his experience and abilities, pushing ahead without working on anything for too long, even though this was what he really needed to improve. Even at the height of his career, Wood was barely hanging on financially, always hoping the next one would be his big break. When shooting, he usually only let them get one take unless it was totally mangled. He would turn down extra takes by saying it was more realistic, when likely it was more about wasting money on film. He'd say filmmaking is not about the tiny details, it's about the big picture. This sums up all the problems with his philosophy because, as they say, the devil's in the details, meaning problems often lie in seemingly insignificant parts that we overlook. For Wood, the blind optimism that kept him focused on the big picture worked against him. So much of his pain could have been alleviated if he found one story, stuck with it for a while, and accepted that those of us without time, money, or connections at our disposal have to do things differently. Jumping from project to project, changing ideas instead of fleshing them out, Frankensteining them into whatever will get you a yes, will drive you insane. At some point, blind optimism is just that, insanity. A According to the quote famously misattributed to Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Ironically, given how Wood and Lugosi's lives played out, this actually comes from Narcotics Anonymous. As depressing as it is, for anything we do, money and time make all the difference. And Wood ran out of both. He didn't exactly stop telling stories. Rather, his career faded as he struggled with severe alcoholism, poverty, and an inability to find mainstream success, eventually turning to writing pornographic novels to survive. His later years were marked by a decline in passion, with stories becoming more about paying the bills than artistic vision. When he died at the age of 54, he and his wife had just been evicted from their home, and 2 years later, he was awarded a Golden Turkey Award for Worst Director of All Time, renewing public interest in his life and work. 2 years! That's it! The longer you live, timing really feels like a big cosmic joke. Don't get me wrong, it takes little effort to look at the past and criticize. Just like how it's easy to look at someone else's life from the outside, seeing the tiny details, even the big picture that they overlook, and swear we would handle it better. Wood's life provides the juxtaposition to the usual Hollywood fantasy. What if you go to Hollywood and don't become a great success? What if you keep trying anyway? I have no idea how true Tim Burton's story is to what actually happened. But the final fate of Wood in that movie is more frightening the older I get. Ed Wood was likely terrified too that he was following Lugosi's path and still hadn't succeeded in making a film that matched his imagination or his idealized horror films like Dracula. He gave in to his need for a drink and never stopped drinking, seemingly giving up hope in the end. But I like to think maybe he really didn't. He needed the alcohol to suppress his hope and energy because he was doing his best and got tired of no one seeing him or his movies for the depth of value he thought they possessed. In the movie, he compared his success at 30 with people like Orson Welles who got Citizen Kane at 26. But he was still young, something he knew but pushed to the back of his mind, covering it with blind optimism instead of just accepting the truth and finding the courage to go on regardless. Ed Wood is a fascinating and tragic figure. He never lost faith in his films. His friends and the people who cared about him believed if he'd had the money and time, he would have realized his biggest dreams. What he desired was to make films that showed the truth, which he did, and he was fully willing to show his weirdness and quirks to the world, yet couldn't reconcile his goals with reality. And that's the real problem with blind optimism. It's not about being positive. It's about refusing to see what's actually there. Holding on to our fears only traps us in them. It doesn't make them go away. True optimism that will get you through your hardest days needs honesty to be genuinely helpful. And without it, we're just lying to ourselves until time runs out. Every artist will have their heart broken by the world. I said this at the beginning of the video because it's something I've told myself a million times. Because while watching Ed Wood, I saw him get his heart broken over and over again. By backers who forced him to change, by an industry who mocked him, by people he admired who called him a joke, and eventually by time itself, dying 2 years before anyone would care. Which is why I called him a cautionary tale. Wood promoted his films as written, produced, directed by Edward D. Wood Jr., but honestly, his films were always the result of those he surrounded himself with. The people who believed in him, the people who made his vision possible even when it was messy and illogical. It wasn't his skill as a director or even as a storyteller, but his passion and drive, his ability to make others hope, that made him so special. And yet for such a long time, he was remembered as a failure, an imposter who lied about his abilities. But this isn't about a lack of talent. If it were, Orson Welles, the Great One, wouldn't have died with a mountain of debt despite his genius. He, like Wood, was seen as an outsider because of his political views, anti-establishment attitude, controversial films, and clashes with powerful figures who, like Wood's backers, always wanted to change things to satisfy their greed. They both died with integrity, in a sense, despite what people said of them trying to scrape by. So, what's the difference between Ed Wood and Orson Welles? talent, money, time? It really doesn't matter. Both of them died broke and broken by the world. And that brings us back to where we started, the thing that neither Maya Angelou nor Einstein could escape: imposter syndrome. Success doesn't protect you from heartbreak, especially not self-imposed heartbreak from doubts that seem to never shut up. And maybe that's why in the biopic Wood meets Orson Welles, an event that never happened. Wood asks him if the struggle is all worth it, and Welles, the man he saw as the ultimate success, tells him it is when it works. He says the one film he can still watch is Citizen Kane, the one the studio hated but couldn't touch a frame of. He says visions are worth fighting for. Why spend your life making someone else's dreams? And that's beautiful advice. Fight for your dreams. It's also dangerously blind optimism, which is why it's a work of fiction inspired by Wood's life, and I didn't feel as uplifted by the scene as much as I felt sad. Because this is how Wood lived. The dialogue in his films, like his idealism, was enthusiastically unrealistic. But that still doesn't make him an imposter. At the end of the day, he worked hard and has his name on movies that say Made in Hollywood, USA. Ed Wood's best movies, Plan 9, Glenn or Glenda, have a ton of his authentic self in them. And if you've ever written poetry as a teenager, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was terrible, but it was real emotion. And that's not something to be ashamed of. That's where you start. There's nothing wrong with making bad art. The problem is never learning how to make it better. Because improving is simpler than we think. It's just not easy. But take that dramatic license and just go for it. Flick that chip off your shoulder and use that free will to have some fun. The journey is what's important. It allows the doubt to exist in a separate place in your body, and the one thing you can look back on fondly even if the world and time abandon you. The qualities that made Wood's movies failures when they came out are why they're loved today. They endured because they're a confidence trick, an hour-long magic act. Plan 9 is about the horrors of war perpetuated by arrogance, that even violence and moral superiority transcend species. This is the kind of heart that proves no matter how bad his skills were, Wood gave his all. In Glenn or Glenda, Wood's character decides to tell his love interest the truth. She initially reacts with distress, but ultimately decides to stay with him. She offers him her sweater as a sign of acceptance, almost like he wanted to write himself a happy ending. One that, at least professionally, would never come. So, what's the real lesson here? Well, if you're accomplishing your goals, you're going to wonder, does any of it matter? And it does. Unlike others, you have a full visibility of yourself, and sometimes the smallest mistake is conflated in your mind with a huge problem. The rest of the world is not looking at you that way. While you look at everything you haven't done yet, they're looking at all the ways you're creating value now. You're going to feel like an imposter because your goalpost keeps moving. That's just the way it is unless you have zero self-awareness. So what do you do if you have imposter syndrome? The answer is to know you're not alone. It's impossible to actually be an imposter when there's so many of us who feel the same way. I always remind myself that this feeling is an opportunity, not to shield myself with blind optimism, but for growth, to become the person I truly want to be. We have to focus on the ways we can get better and keep striving toward that person. Know that when you don't give up or shield yourself from mistakes, that is when you create shit. You'll like making shit no matter if it's actually shit or gold. And if you've got a pinch of humility, you're going to feel like a loser sometimes. Don't focus more on your weaknesses than your strengths, but recognize your weaknesses for the opportunities they are. Ed Wood was an imposter in some ways, but his enthusiasm and passion were sincere. We can't banish the feelings of imposter syndrome entirely, but perhaps we can feel freer to be honest about our feelings and build confidence in a simple truth. You've worked hard to be where you are. Don't deny the journey because your destination isn't all you expected. And I think that's what I've learned from Ed Wood's story, that passion without craft is tragic, but craft without passion is empty. We need both. And the only way to get them is to be honest about where we are, keep learning, and never stop making things, even when they're imperfect. After all, perfect is boring. If you made it this far, thanks for exploring Ed Wood's messy, heartbreaking, inspiring life with me. And if you've ever wondered whether you're good enough to create things you dream about, ditto. That's why I'm Pickle Ditto, because whatever storytelling pickle you're in, I've probably been there too.